We now turn to economics. Some of the questions in the last session were already tending in the direction of economics, but we'll now talk about the economic aspects of U.S.-China relations in a much more direct way. We'll start with two people, Fred Bergston and Peter Botelier, talking about exchange rates, and then we'll move to three people, my colleague Dick Cooper, and Tong Min and David Richards, talking about consumption and saving. Then after the five of them speak for, I hope, 10 minutes apiece, we'll then have a few minutes for backing and forthing among the five of them, or perhaps the six of us, if I'm so moved. And then we will once again open the floor for questions, and I hope we get the same high quality and interesting variety of questions in this session that we had in the previous session. I'm not going to take time to introduce everyone. Everybody has, I hope, the program. Everybody has, I hope, the speaker biographies. And so in the interest of time, let me turn immediately to Fred Bergston from the Peterson Institute. Fred?
Thanks, Ben. The topic that we're assigned is exchange rates. But before that, I want to spend 1 minute picking up on the question from the earlier panel about the growth outlook for China. And I want to strongly support what I think was the Ezra Vogel view. My conclusion is that China will continue to grow at least 10% for another 10 years, if not 20. And there are two main reasons for that. China is only about halfway through the transition of moving its population from the rural, western, agricultural part of the economy to the modernized, privatized, more efficient part of the economy. Every time a Chinese worker moves from the first sector to the second sector, her or his productivity goes up by a factor of 15. And that is a major explanation for the double-digit growth rate of the last 30 years, as the first half of that rural agricultural population moved into the modern sector. But there's still half to go. And we know that any modern economy will reduce its agricultural sector to less than 10% of the population. That's likely to happen in China. That, too, will produce an ongoing, very sizable productivity boost to the economy, and therefore growth. Second factor, China is also only about halfway through the transition from state-owned enterprises to marketized enterprises. Probably won't go to 100%, but it's only halfway through. Every time a worker moves from the state-owned sector to the privatized sector, her or his productivity goes up by a factor of 2. Not quite as much, but still significant. So there are essentially two continuing major reservoirs of additional huge productivity growth in the Chinese economy that are likely to spur continued rapid growth. I would conservatively say close to double-digit range for another decade, maybe 2. That's an obiter dictum at the start. Now I turn to the exchange rate. It's a little hard to put the exchange rate into the long-term perspective of this conference due to the immediacy of the issue and its key role in the current global recovery and rebalancing objectives. But the exchange rate certainly is a systemic and long-term issue as well. So I'll say a few words about the short and medium-term picture and then wind up with some comments on the long-term and systemic implications of the exchange rate and the exchange rate system. The big global current account imbalances are a big problem for three reasons. And keep in mind that the U.S. and China, while we are the two biggest economies in the world, are on the opposite sides of that international imbalances equation. The U.S. is by far the biggest deficit country. China is by far the biggest surplus country. And if you believe the IMF projections over the next 3 to 5 years, China's global surplus will rise again to a level where it's actually larger than the U.S. global deficit. So that China would be the biggest single imbalance in the world economy, but roughly equal to the U.S. So think of the two as the opposite sides of the big global imbalance. That's been largely true to date. It will become even more true on the IMF's projections of the next several years. Why is that a problem? One, the global imbalances were a major source of the global crisis. The huge inflows of foreign capital to the United States, required to finance the U.S. deficit, kept U.S. monetary conditions easy, kept interest rates down, promoted underpricing of risk, encouraged overlending and overborrowing, and created the conditions that made the crisis not maybe inevitable, but certainly facilitated it. Now, I certainly would not charge that the Chinese and other creditor countries forced the U.S. banks to make stupid subprime loans. Obviously not. But that nexus of imbalances and associated capital flows created the conditions which, at a minimum, made the crisis possible, and some would say actually promoted it and brought it on. Second, the buildup of external imbalances on the deficit side, to wit the United States, can at some point produce a huge debt crisis, a buildup of a foreign debt position that would lead to a crash of the dollar and the hard landing that has been anticipated by some of us for quite a while. Not so fancifully, because the U.S. came close to it already back in the late 1970s when we were still the world's largest creditor country. Now the U.S. is already the world's largest debtor country. Our foreign debt to GDP ratio is not so bad, but it is rising substantially. We published a study at my institute last year that showed that on realistic assumptions about U.S. and foreign growth going forward for the next 10 to 20 years, U.S. current account deficits, U.S. foreign debt would explode to levels that are far beyond any imaginable thresholds and would require some kind of adjustment along the way, possibly a crisis and a hard landing. Take the 2 points together that I've just made, and the conclusion, I think, is inexorable that from a U.S. standpoint, running big foreign deficits, big current account deficits, is bad business. It's clearly bad if at some point the foreigners stop financing us and bring on a dollar crash and a hard landing, but it's also bad if they do finance us, because that then builds up the kind of conditions that brought on the crisis. That doesn't say we should run a balance at all times. All it does say is we should avoid big imbalances of the type we've seen before and might be headed toward again. And the third reason why the imbalances are bad is because over time they make it very hard to run an open trade policy. Somebody mentioned earlier that if you have big disequilibrium exchange rates, big current account imbalances, you actually undermine some of the fundamental precepts on which open trade policies are based. Historically, when the U.S. has experienced an overvalued dollar, a rising external deficit, that's when protectionist pressures have come on strong in the Congress and the body politic, made it hard to maintain an open trade policy. We could easily see that again. So the imbalances are a bad thing, and that's why the G20, as it has plotted a global strategy for recovering from the crisis, has insisted not only on recovery per se, stimulus measures, waiting exit strategies until the recovery is well established, but also a rebalancing of the recovery so that we will not recreate the conditions of these big imbalances, which the G20 has concluded, I think rightly, are unsustainable and bad business for the world economy, for financial stability, and for an open trading system. Now, in that context, with the U.S. and China as the big polar extremes, a lot has to be done by both countries. The U.S., as the deficit country, obviously has a big responsibility. Over time, that means bringing our budget deficit under control. I would say running small surpluses over the business cycle, and that should be the objective of U.S. fiscal policy over the medium run. There are other things we need to do, make sure the dollar is not overvalued, but fiscal policy is the big U.S. responsibility. On the Chinese side, as the big surplus country, adequate growth of domestic demand, which is really the topic for the next group of speakers, which in a way should come before us, but China to shift its basic growth strategy from relying as much as it has on expanding trade surpluses and export-led growth over to relying more heavily on domestic demand. Again, not very controversial. The Chinese leadership has publicly been saying that for at least the last 5 or 6 years. The issue is when to do it. When will that occur? Will it be done adequately? There is good news. Between 2006-07 and last year, the big imbalances came down. The Chinese surplus came down from 11% of its GDP to about 5.5%. The U.S. external deficit came down from about 6% to 3%. So there was good progress toward rebalancing. Unfortunately, the numbers have now started to turn around. The IMF projection is that the Chinese surplus is headed back to 8% over the next 3 or 4 years. The U.S. deficit has already moved back to an annual rate of 5% of our GDP, and as I mentioned on the projections we've done, will go to not only much higher than previous record levels, but levels that would be literally unsustainable and would cause a crisis if anything like that were to occur. So within that context, both the U.S. and China need to take major actions. That is the context in which the exchange rate issue comes up. It is clearly not the totality or perhaps even the most important part of the adjustment process. In the Chinese, as in the U.S. case, as I said, it's fiscal correction. In the Chinese case, it's moving from the export-led growth model to the domestic demand growth model. And there are 6 or 8 major reasons purely in China's internal interest, leaving alone the international repercussions, why that's a good idea. But the exchange rate is a central part of the question. And it takes 2 to tango. The U.S. can't maintain an equilibrium exchange rate for the dollar unless China maintains an equilibrium exchange rate for the renminbi. And so it is essential to work from both sides to get the currencies in order. The big problem from the Chinese side is not solely the substantial undervaluation of the renminbi, but the way it's occurred. It has occurred through direct Chinese intervention in the currency markets to keep the renminbi artificially low. Our estimates at our institute, which have come down recently, incidentally, suggest that the renminbi is now undervalued on a trade-weighted average basis by about 15%. That would imply 25% against the dollar. Importantly, that definition is based on bringing China's surplus not down to 0, but down to 3% of its GDP, which we think would be sustainable. If you wanted to eliminate China's surplus, you'd have to double those numbers, and the undervaluation would be 25 to 40%. On the U.S. side, those are the magnitudes we're talking about, a substantial need for further revaluation or appreciation of the renminbi. As I say, that undervaluation has been directly generated by huge Chinese intervention in the currency markets. Over $1 billion a day for most of the last 3 or 4 years. That's why China's foreign exchange reserves have soared now to near $2.5 trillion and will be headed to $3 trillion certainly within the next year or so. China has therefore deliberately held the price of the renminbi down, the price of the dollar up, and that has added considerably to China's competitive position in the world economy. Now, some people have argued that the exchange rate is not very important. So we are releasing a new study tomorrow that estimates what would be the impact of Chinese currency revaluation on both its own current account and on the U.S. position. We've used 4 different models to do it, different approaches, and they all kind of coalesce on a range of numbers. The conclusion is as follows. If China were to let the currency rise by only 10%, about half of what I suggest is needed, if China let the currency rise about 10%, it would produce a reduction in China's global current account surplus of somewhere between $180 billion and $250 billion with the 2-year time lag involved. In other words, it would take a substantial share, maybe a third to a half, off China's global surplus. That's always assuming, incidentally, that domestic demand measures would be put in place so that there would not be a reduction in China's overall growth. There'd be a shift from foreign demand to domestic demand, and the exchange rate price change would lead to that significant reduction in China's surplus. The United States would see its global current account deficit decline somewhere between $25 to $50 billion from the rise of 10% in the Chinese currency. If the Chinese currency went up more like 20%, which is what would strike us as the needed realignment to come back to an equilibrium position, then the U.S. gain would be between $50 and $100 billion, an important addition to the U.S. correction, and a significant addition, incidentally, at a position of high unemployment to U.S. jobs. Final point is simply to note that the Chinese, a little over a month ago, indicated they would again start letting the currency go up. Recall back from 2005 to 2008, they let the currency go up by about 20%. They then stopped it for the last 2 years. If they did that again over the next 2 to 3 years, that would largely recover the kind of equilibrium position that we think is necessary. Over the first month of the new policy, they've only let the rate go up by 0.8%, so we don't really know yet if it will be enough, and that will be the question. Final point, long run, our new study also shows that China's very rapid productivity growth, including for the reasons I mentioned at the outset, suggests that to avoid a continued buildup of external surpluses, it needs to let its currency rise by something like 2% per year. This is the famous Balassa-Samuelson effect. That's like Thucydides' theorem for the political scientists. Balassa-Samuelson effect says that particularly developing countries with rapid productivity growth need to let their currencies go up by a corresponding amount to avoid building up big trade surpluses. And therefore, China needs to cooperate in a longer-term sense, help foster a global monetary system that will facilitate currency changes of that type in order to avoid a buildup of big new imbalances. If China does not do that, the question will emerge, should the U.S. or the world as a whole react through trade policy measures, unilateral steps, or other undesirable means that would upset the apple cart in terms of the overall relationship that we talked about before. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. The next speaker, also on the topic of exchange rates, is Peter Botellier from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Peter?
Thank you. Like Fred, I'd like to start with a comment on growth prospects. And I agree with him that there is a high probability of continued high growth for some considerable period. But I have some doubts that the turbo growth that we have seen in most of the past decade can be continued. I think it's more likely that the growth rate will come down to the 7 to 8% range, mainly for two reasons. One is that the domestic demand, consumer demand, is going to be a much more important driver of total demand in China and total growth in China, rather than the export demand, which was so important in the past decade. And secondly, unit labor costs are likely to start rising or have already begun to rise in China. In economics, we call this that a country like China has passed the Lewis point. That means it run out of vast surpluses of rural labor. Unit labor costs are likely to rise because nominal wages are rising very rapidly, probably well in excess of productivity growth. That means the corporate sector is now faced with the high probability of rising labor costs, and they haven't really had that in the past decade. Labor costs were declining on a per unit of output basis, even though real wages were increases. That situation, I think, suggests that it will be harder to achieve the turbo growth rates of the past decade. In any event, China will have to shift dependence towards higher technology and higher capital intensity to compensate for these rising labor costs. On the question of the exchange rate, I'd like to start by answering the question that Fred raised at the end of his presentation. Should we consider punitive action if China doesn't do what we feel it ought to do on the exchange rate? My bottom line is that we would all be better off if threats of this nature were taken off the agenda. And I have several reasons for that. All previous talks about such threats have only created unproductive tension in the bilateral relationship, have not led to anything constructive, and are not likely to lead to anything constructive in the future. Secondly, Although I agreed, of course, exchange rates and nominal exchange rates are an important part of the overall pattern, overall trading dynamics in the world and in the bilateral relationship, the nominal exchange rate is often misunderstood as a key driver of such changes. The nominal exchange rate is not nearly as important as the real exchange rate. And besides, we should also recognize that apart from exchange rate, macroeconomic policies, fiscal policies, monetary policies have a significant influence on trade flows besides exchange rates. So if we make calculations of the effects of exchange rate changes on trade balances, trade surpluses, we then have to assume that other policies remain the same, which they never do. The ceteris paribus condition for these projections of the effect of exchange rate on trade flows hardly ever apply. So I would be in favor of de-emphasizing in the bilateral dialogue the importance of the nominal exchange rate. If we wish to discuss the exchange rate, by all means, but let us put it in the broader picture of economic policies, including fiscal and monetary policies, and allow the Chinese also to complain about American macro policies, and, as they do. The exchange rate, I think, should be de-emphasized in the bilateral dialogue. I think there is another reason why I believe it can be taken and should be taken off the agenda, because I think there's a high probability the problem will take care of itself in the years ahead. I sense a considerable reduced enthusiasm in China for the export promotion policies of the past decade. There's much more talk about economic rebalancing. There's no major policy speech without emphasis on the need for rebalancing. I think China has now begun to see this massive hoard of foreign exchange almost as much as a problem for them and a risk and vulnerability as a source of strength. So I think the enthusiasm to continue building these foreign exchange reserves is much less than it may have been in the past. Furthermore, the rebalancing to which Fred also referred, I think is happening. I've seen the IMF projections, and I was happy that the Article 4 report was released the other day, which is the first time since 2007 that the Chinese government has permitted in Article 4 to be put in the public domain. And I've seen the IMF projections on the current account forecast, but I don't agree with them. I'm much more inclined to agree with China's own projections for the current account balance, which suggests a 4 to 5% surplus in this current calendar year, 2010. I think that's more realistic. Remember that the enthusiasm for trade surpluses is no longer what it used to be in China. When China was anticipating a trade deficit in March, the trade minister, Chen Deming, went public and beat himself on the chest and said, we will have a trade deficit next month, as though it was something, an enormous accomplishment. There is a change of attitude. And even though in June and July the trade surplus has gone up again, which raises the question, what do we have for the second year? My inclination is to think that the majority in the leadership in China is now convinced that these large imbalances are bad for China, bad for the world, and bad for bilateral relationships with the United States. Allow me to conclude with some comments on how and when this undervaluation problem arose. We lose sight of that. But I think history, as we know from the earlier session, is an important part of knowledge and policy making. Fred is right in saying that the undervaluation is exemplified, is illustrated by the fact that China's central bank has bought a lot of foreign exchange in the interbank foreign exchange market, thereby freezing the nominal exchange rate. Now, you cannot really freeze it without buying these excess reserves. So the essence of the point is the fixed exchange rate policy. Now, when did that exchange rate and how did it become undervalued? Was it something that China began to do because it set out to achieve unfair trade advantages? I don't believe that that's a correct historical perspective. When China froze the exchange rate in December 97. That was after the collapse of the South Korean financial system. And Chu Rong-ji, who was then still the deputy prime minister to become the prime minister a year later, decided not to devalue the currency but to freeze the exchange rate even more tightly than it had been since 95. The rest of the world applauded China for what was then seen as a very constructive act. Nobody complained about the exchange rate at that time being fundamentally misaligned or undervalued. So if it became undervalued at a later point, it's not because of something China did. China did not begin a policy to achieve undervaluation. I believe it happened in the second half of 2003 mainly because of a combination of external and domestic factors. Let me mention a few. External demand for China's exports, for exports generally, exploded as a result of the tremendous credit expansion in the United States, the UK, Spain, and a few other countries. It was external demand that China could respond to on the supply side. It was one of the very few countries that actually could. Why could it? Because the reforms that had been put in motion from the late 90s onward, again by this man Chu Rong-ji, had been so effective. China's manufacturing productivity growth rate had been extremely high since the late 90s. The private sector, the non-state sector, had become much more important than it had ever been since 49. That created a supply capacity in China that was unmatched anywhere else in the world. China responded to the external demand. China did not create the external demand. China was not about to abandon the fixed exchange rate policy in 2003 and not even in 2004, partly because I think the policy had served them well. They believed it was the right policy. The rest of the world had told them it was the right policy in 97, in 98. And they didn't want to respond to the pressures which then expressed by the American government, the Japanese government, the European government, partly because they didn't want to reward the speculators who had brought in large amounts of hot money flow after China had become a WTO member. In 2001, the short part of the capital balance of China's balance of payments turned around from a net capital flight. The short-term capital flows turned into huge net capital inflows. These were the speculative inflows in response to exchange rate expectations and, I think more importantly, real estate price increases in the big cities. China did not want to reward the speculators who had brought in that money by raising the nominal exchange rate. Nor they were also afraid that if they were to begin a policy of appreciation, that would only encourage even more hot money inflows and make their domestic monetary policy even more difficult. So they pursued, at least for the time being, 2003, 2004, first half of 2005, the policy they knew best, that is keep the exchange rate where it is and accept the consequence, that is the central bank has to buy the surplus offered in the interbank foreign exchange market. I think it was in 2005, July 2005, that the leadership was finally persuaded that surpluses were of a structural nature and that they had to adopt another policy. So if we look at the history of this, the undervaluation did not begin to be a problem because of anything China did. It began to be a problem because of external demand led by the United States. There's one further reason why I believe forward-looking that we don't have to assume that China will continue the policy of aiming at large surpluses and large foreign exchange build-up, and that is the central bank itself. In the past, the central bank could sterilize the excess foreign exchange, or the excess domestic monetary circulation that resulted from the buying of foreign exchange at a profit. That means they could earn more on the foreign securities they bought with the foreign exchange than they had to pay on their domestic debt. That period is over. The central bank on the margin is now making a loss because they get very low return on their treasuries. They have to pay also low interest rate, but slightly higher interest rates domestically. So the central bank, from a balance sheet point of view, is now actually in an awkward position That is the final point. I think we should de-emphasize the importance of the nominal exchange rate, take it off the congressional agenda, embed the exchange rate discussion in broader macro discussions, and give the Chinese as much say on our domestic macro policies in the U.S. as we feel we can say about their domestic macro policies. And if you take it off the agenda, I think you don't have to worry that you will lose much, because the problem is likely to take care of itself anyway in the next few years.
Thank you, Peter. There's plenty on the table now that we could pause to talk about exchange rates on the basis of what Fred and Peter have said, but I think we should not do that. In the interest of time, we're now going to move on to 3 sets of remarks directed at the not entirely unrelated subject of consumption and saving behavior in China. So let me turn first to my colleague from the Harvard Economics Department, Richard Cooper. Dick?
Thank you. This is not a topic that I chose. I was assigned to it, and it's much less cosmic than the discussion we had earlier in the afternoon, which involved potentials for war and peace and so forth. But as Ben has just said, savings and investment behavior are at the core of the macroeconomic factors which both Fred Bergston and Peter Botelier have talked about. So I'm going to say something about, I'm going to be disciplined and say something about the topic I was assigned to. I'm going to do it under 3 headings: households, corporations, the corporate sector, and the government sector. And under the household sector, I have 7 points, but I'll cover them briefly. The big picture is that the rest of the world has taken the view, the U.S. most explicitly, the Europeans with increasing fervor, that China saves too much, and that is the counterpart of the surpluses in the Chinese current account. And therefore, in order to reduce those surpluses, as Bergston says we have to get Chinese savings up or Chinese investment down, some combination of the 2 of those things. Let me start with households and the sometime impression that Chinese are frugal by nature and have trouble consuming. And I just would, anyone who visited China recently and as recently as 10 years ago knows that that is totally untrue. I think I'm right in saying that consumption has risen no more rapidly anywhere in the world than it has in China, 8% a year, real consumption by households. In China, the Chinese have demonstrated that they're just like other people, that as their incomes go up, and as the possibility to spend on things that look attractive go up, they spend. They improve their diet, they improve their housing, they improve their transportation, and so forth. Second, Chinese behavior is not unusual. We've seen the pattern in Japan, in Korea, Taiwan, and more recently than China, in the case of India, where when incomes go up rapidly, consumption goes up rapidly, but the savings rate also goes up. With rapidly rising incomes that are not expected to continue at that rate indefinitely, people naturally save more. And the Chinese, this is my 3rd point, actually have good reason to save. They have greater longevity, like the rest of us. They have fewer children to look after them, constrained to 1 child per family in large parts of the country. They have no guarantee, no persuasive guarantee that they're going to have health care in their old age, and so forth. So there are actually rational reasons for households to save. Fourth, if you think about it, in this country or in Canada or in Europe, and the same applies to China, as incomes rise, a large part of expenditures, increased expenditures, are actually linked to space. It's very hard to put a piano in a 700 square foot studio room. And so that future consumption, particularly of durables, of household durables, furniture and appliances and so forth, is linked to space. And so that's my fifth point. Home construction has just been going gangbusters in China. It's partly a function of the mobility, the urbanization, which has been mentioned, which has been fantastic in China. It's been the most rapidly urbanizing country, again, I think, in history. Moved 20% of a huge population from rural into urban areas in the last 25 years. All that requires housing. As incomes rise, people want both better housing and more space. And more space is associated with more consumption. So all of that's going on, but let me remind you that in the national accounts, housing is counted as investment and not as consumption. But in fact, from the point of view of an ordinary household perception, more home space and consumption are at least consumption of some items are closely linked. My sixth point is there's actually, from experience in the United States and in other countries, there's not much policy can do about private household savings. Our levers for influencing household savings are very, very limited. Several things are mentioned. Better safety net for Chinese families, better health care, better pensions, and so forth. But given the turbulent experience that at least older Chinese remember, it's history to younger Chinese now, but the ordinary household is quite sensibly distrustful of promises by the Chinese government. They will believe in better health care when they see it, and they probably will have to see it for several years before they really believe it's there to stay. So while I think these are highly desirable expenditures from the point of view of Chinese society, the hope that they will quickly reduce Chinese household saving, reduce Chinese household saving because the household no longer has to prepare for these possible contingencies, I think is just wishful thinking. A second policy development is the development of consumer credit, which we know in the United States and in other countries that have experienced it can help stimulate household spending. Part of that is the mortgage market, which is growing very, very rapidly in China, but from a very low base. And it requires essentially experienced managers in the banks and changes in habit, both by households and banks, to get used to borrowing. And then there are other forms of consumer credit, for example, to buy automobiles and to buy other things. Those are also developing in China, but they involve changes in habits, some institutional developments like credit ratings, which take time to develop. So my seventh point, as far as household savings and expenditure are concerned, is be patient. Something that Americans tend to be very short of. I have no doubt that the Chinese in this respect are no different from other peoples around the world that we've observed over the decades, and that as their incomes rise, their spending will rise, but that requires both changes in habits and changes in institutional developments. Now let me contrast with the household two other sectors of the economy. One is the corporate sector, because while household savings in China are high by American, or indeed even by European standards, they are not high, as I suggested, by the standards of Japan or Korea at their comparable stages of development. But national savings is very high in China. A large part of that is corporate saving. And the corporate saving arises because the corporations that have survived the cutbacks of about a decade ago in the state-owned enterprises are now much trimmer. They've had big productivity increases. They are sometimes quasi-monopolies, and they enjoy quasi-public utility status. The petroleum companies, for example, and the telecom companies, they're very profitable, and for reasons that are entirely unclear to me, but I can make them up. I mean, I can conjecture about them. The government, which is the owner of many of these very profitable corporations, is very reluctant to require them to pay dividends. An obvious thing to me to get national savings, not household savings, but national savings down, would be to require the profitable state-owned enterprises to pay dividends. The Chinese, I think, can be seriously faulted on this, but they have lots and lots of company. Most American managers hate paying dividends, and they want to retain the earnings to keep them under the control of the manager. So again, Chinese are just like other folks. But why the Ministry of Finance puts up with it is a mystery which people who know China better than I do might be able to explain. Anyway, it's an obvious thing the Chinese could do, is bring some of these corporate earnings into the government budget. And then, of course, they have to spend them to make them effective. And the second thing on the corporate side is that small and medium-sized enterprises, overwhelmingly private, have terrible difficulty still getting credit from the Chinese banking system. The Chinese banking system is overwhelming, which is a huge repository of household savings in China, makes most of its loans directly or indirectly to state-owned enterprises. State-owned in China does not necessarily or typically mean owned by the central government. A lot of them are owned by provinces and local authorities. And so there's some interest by local officials in having the banks supporting their favorite locally owned activities. But it means that private enterprise is somewhat starved for capital in China, in this country with excess savings. And an obvious institutional change would be to get the banks to lend to private sectors. It's not as easy as you might think. I'll tell a story on the man who is now the president of Czechoslovakia, of the Czech Republic, split it. But in 1990, he became finance minister, and I had gotten to know him when he was a dissident, and I asked him if I could help in any way, and he said, the most effective thing you can do is send me any material you can get your hands on how banks should make loans to private enterprise. A very curious statement from a serious official, but I mean, tells a lot about the way state-owned enterprises function in communist countries, as China was in its economic system. And making loans skillfully without losing your depositors' money is actually quite a technical skill. The third sector is the government. The interesting thing is that alone among the major countries of the world, the top 10 or 15, the Chinese central government is a large net saver, 6% of GDP. That does not mean, this is economics talk, that does not mean they don't spend money, but what it does mean is that they spend money on investment rather than on government consumption. And that is anomalous, and lots of people talk about the need for a Chinese much better social safety net, which the Chinese government is working on. They did a lot last year to improve it, but there's a lot more that they can do. And so there are many respects in which the net savings of the Chinese government could be significantly diminished by skillful choice of expenditure on non-investment activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Our next panelist, also on the subject of consumption and saving behavior, is Dong Min from the China Development Research Foundation.
Okay, thank you. And since we developed a rule, seems everybody have to talk about whether China can maintain the long-term development, the 10% or above a growth rate. And I may also make a few words comments about that. I think now whether China can maintain this 10% growth rate or not become less important in China now. It's more, we now among the economists, we more concerned with the quality of growth. And if this 10% growth make an imbalanced growth, that would be, we would like the little bit slower than getting more balanced growth than the imbalanced growth. In that sense, I would say that among all the imbalance problems, the saving investment and the external imbalance, internal imbalance, it's most important part. In fact, this is not discussed recently. In fact, 5 years ago, among the economists, we are already very seriously discussing this issue. Now, among the saving investment, in fact, the other part of coin is consumption. And in fact, it's to addressing saving investment, we have to look at the consumption part. Now, the perception is China consume less, but Professor Richard said actually China is not consumption is not very low. In fact, if you take a look at this graph, and that red is not too much red, is consumption as a percentage growth rate. You can see that since 2008, the consumption growth, this is real growth, the nominal growth. The real growth of consumption is near 18%. GDP around 10% growth, but the consumption in real terms is 18% growth, even during the economic crisis period. Only short period, a drop in consumption, but very quick, within 1 quarter, consumption again back up. So consumption in recent year is increased very fast. However, overall, in the longer term, since 1970s until now, the consumption as a percentage of GDP is continued decline. If we're using 1980s starting reform compared with 2008, we can see that consumption usually is about 55% GDP, and by the end of 2008, it become a 37% GDP. It's dropping about near 20%, a percentage of GDP. So overall, in absolute terms, because GDP grows fast and consumption in the money terms is increasing, but as percentage GDP is declining. You know, if you do not have much domestic consumption, then you depend on export, also depend on investment. So this reducing of consumption is most important for the high saving and high investment or high trade surplus. Now, compare with other countries, you can see that by the end of this year, maybe next year, China's GDP total is already overpassed Japan. But compared with Japan's consumption, China's still substantially below Japan. And if you compare United States and compare Europe, and despite the GDP amounts high, but consumption very low. Now, why consumption so low in China? And because China wants to saving more, but however, it's declining. Why so fast, particularly in recent years? And the reason now Chinese economy find out, because income as a percentage of GDP also declining. If your income decline, of course your consumption decline. And also very parallel, a share for labor income in GDP dropped from 56%, 56% or near 57% in 2008, now become 37%, 36.7% in year 2005, and 2008 even a little bit lower. So because the income, labor income as a percentage GDP dropping, and therefore the household consumption parallelly dropping. And why China consumption is so low compared with other countries? You compare this one, United States, 61%, Japan's 56%, and Canada and Korea all about 50%, but China only have a 37%. If the income, the labor income so low as a percentage of the share, well, who are getting money? and the money will go to the corporations, also to the government. For example, the share of a corporation, share the capital as a percentage GDP increased by 20 percentage point. And the labor income dropped by 20 percentage point, but on the other hand, the capital income increased by 20 percentage point. So the problem is labor income reduced, but corporate income will increase very fast. If that's the case, then how to addressing that in future? It's very important to increase for labor's income. So very recently, there are some about thinking of within 5 years will double labor income in China. So every year, about 20% growth of a labor income. GDP grows about 10%, inflation about 2 to 3%. That means about 16 to 17% every year for labor income. So this is a huge increase. But how can you increase labor's income? If a government officials, you can increase the government's employees' salaries. But majority is in the private sector, even in the public sector, but still they run as corporations. How can you increase their income? Government cannot order for that. So recently, government thinking of one approach which is very dramatic and could work well or could be wrong, as now they start to mobilize labor union. And that's why you heard recently and some the strike of Honda or Toyota or whatever. Right? And because China studied other countries' experience, how come those countries, their labor income always increased? They find out labor union play a very important role. And for many years, the Western country pushing China said, why you not allow labor union more free move? But now China starting doing that. So very recently, government, the labor union, labor federation, labor union, and ask all those working units have a strengthening labor union, and that you can see the strike on. So increase global bargaining. It looks very effective because Honda, Toyota, all increased by 30%, 20% within few months. So whether they will be spread all the countries, whether that become a major confrontation about the strike, we do not know. But that's the one way Chinese government want to pushing up the labor income. And the other one is to promote SME, private sector development. When you make a labor market tight, and that the salary will increase. For example, recently, all the rural migrants, their salary increase very fast. The reason is there are some shortage. But if government give a more favorable to SMEs, the labor market more tight and the salary increase even faster. So there's another approach Chinese government moving on, and this is why recently government the SME development become very important. Private sector development become very important. The other problem is you have to reduce of the corporations' profit, and then the recent proposal is increase SME paid dividend to mutual finance. And China SOE, state-owned enterprises, for quite years, they did not pay dividend. If they do not pay dividend, they reinvest and become an investment rate very high. Also, in the stock market listed company, they also do not pay dividend. If both of them pay dividend, we make a very quick calculation, they can reduce of the increase income by 5% GDP. So that's quite a big. And also, China should control the government fiscal income growth. In the past 10 years, government income grows very fast. And in future, they should also under some controls. And otherwise, the share of labor's income will not increase as fast as what expected. There's one area as increase income and hopefully will increase consumption. But if you increase income, people are still very uncertain on the future, so they do not spend, they still save. And another area is increase of social protections or social welfare system. And last year, our China Development Research Foundation completed a big report on how to improve our social welfare system in China. And for Japan's past experience also shows, and in certain period, saving rate very high, but if really improving our social investment and the household saving rate reduce very fast. Now, China in the past few years, a lot of reform in those areas. Today, when we discussion, many people complain that in the current government seems to not, as the previous government, have so much drastic reforms. It could be true in terms of market-oriented reforms, but in terms of social security type of reforms, social welfare reforms in the past few years really have a big change. For example, currently about more than 90% of farmers have a medical insurance, and majority of the people in the urban area have a medical insurance. That's only happened with the past 3 to 4 years. And by the end of this year, 20 to 30% the rural farmers will have their social, the pensions. That's, again, in the few years ago, it was near zero. So all those areas will play a very important role, and that will continue to doing that part. Now, with all the change, what's the implication to the global economy, to Chinese economy? With income, with salary increase that fast, number one, there are some good part is people's income distribution improving, and society become more stable, and consumption will be increased, and trade balance will be, trade surplus will be reduced. There's a positive side. The negative side is corporations' profit may reduce, and some of the foreign investment, some investment company also should be prepared. Maybe it's not that easier to make money, and the salary have to increase. And China also growth rate, we do not know. And if with such just the increase of consumption and reduce the investment, whether the growth rate still maintain that fast rate, we do not know. So there were uncertainty. What's the implication globally? Number one, it's more balanced globally because China will be more import and less exports, and the trade balance will be better. That will be better than China only reduce export. If they increase consumption, increase import, will everybody benefit for that. Okay. Also, global imbalance will reducing. And finally, I give a point about the exchange rate. Now, in the Chinese economy, so we agree Chinese exchange rate should be more flexible, but reform have to have a sequencing. And at this moment, whether we should move faster than the income increase, labor's income increase, or move faster with exchange rate. When your exchange rate appreciate too much, then you do not have much room to adjust your labor cost. And now we feel the labor cost should be moved fast, and that, in fact, is good to the United States, good to other countries. In the meantime, and gradually we improve our the exchange rate policy, and that within 5 years we will see a good result. Again, I agree, and we should be patient. China's all the reform is gradualism. We have to be patient for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The final speaker on the panel is David Richards. David is a private businessman, but more to the point for his participation today. He's also a very loyal and generous supporter of Harvard University, for which we are all very grateful. David, the floor is yours.
It's easy to come at the end of a program that has so many distinguished people talking. They've covered many of the points I wanted to cover. First of all, I agree that the growth will be rapid. I think I would say it was 7 or 8% rather than 10. And the reasons that are given, I would only add to that the shale gas innovation that's come in that is going to provide cheap gas throughout the world for a long, long time. And this will benefit China, the United States, and everybody else. The point about savings and consumption and the currency level that I want to make is that the policy of the Chinese government was, as been described, to peg the currency against the dollar, with some exceptions. There have been some increases. But the policy that really has caused the greatest problem is the sterilization effort that they made. When there's intervention in the currency market, in other words, China or any other central bank buys dollars to peg the dollar, they provide high-powered money or money base into the economy, which, if it is lent out in the banking system with some fixed ratio of lending to reserves, will create inflation. And the Chinese authorities did not want to have inflation that would result from this, and so they either issued renminbi bonds to the banks that were required to buy them, or they increased the reserve requirements of the banks. And in both cases, that kept the inflation from developing, and it kept the exchange rate undervalued for a long time. But the Chinese were in a difficult position because the United States made two very big mistakes early on in this century. As was pointed out by Peter, the problem of the currency being undervalued didn't really develop until around 2002. That was when you had this very aggressive monetary policy by the Federal Reserve in response to the dot-com crash. And this set off a borrowing binge in the United States that was very much concentrated in housing and other property businesses. It also affected property in places like Ireland and Spain and Eastern Europe. This process was aided and abetted by a change in regulations. It was truly horrendous, which stemmed from an act called the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000, which gets lost, I think, in people's discussion many times. This was virtually the last act that was signed by President Clinton. And what it did was deregulate credit default swaps. It deregulated them from all federal regulation, and it also specifically prevented regulation by state insurance commissioners and state gambling commissioners. And so this vehicle, which is basically an insurance contract if there is an underlying insurable asset, i.e. if you own the bond and you're trying to hedge, or it's a pure gambling contract if you do not have an insurable asset, became in the control of the major banks, investment banks, and provided the opportunity for lenders to absolve themselves of responsibility by basically selling the loan to somebody else. And it opened up enormous opportunities for fraud, particularly in the real estate area. And thus you saw developing in 2004, 5, 6, what they called ninja loans to individuals who had no income, they had no job, and they had no assets, and they were reputed to be able to breathe, but they obtained a loan. And these loans were packaged by Wall Street and through the leisure domain of the persuasion that they had with the credit agencies. Much of this turned out to be AAA rated, which it never should have been because the quality of the loans was really terrible. And with the AAA rating and a regulation by the Basel international banking rules of banks being required to put aside almost no reserves if they invested in something that was rated AAA, you had this incentive to increase credit around the world without little, if any, constraint from reserve requirements of the banks. And so you had this huge speculative bubble that was based not only on speculation, but in large part based on fraudulent debt. And this crashed. As was pointed out by Fred and Peter, the Chinese intervention policy drove down interest rates. When they buy U.S. government bonds, this reduces interest rates. And so there were many investors who were looking for higher yield, and these were provided by these fraudulent vehicles. And so the buildup before the crash was almost inevitably going to lead to some kind of a very serious financial difficulty, which happened. And now you have a situation where, as a result of these sort of interventions on the part of the Chinese and the sterilization and the borrowing that went on, you have maldistribution of assets in business around the world, with much too much in terms of excess capacity in China for export industries, and too much on the consumption side in the United States. And as Fred pointed out, a lot of this has been reduced. I think Peter mentioned he was encouraged that it was going to continue to be reduced, where the U.S. government or the current account deficit has gone from $60 billion a month to $40 billion a month, and a Chinese surplus from 11 to 5 or something like that, which is very positive. But the danger now, in my judgment, is that because of the impatience of the U.S. populace and advocacy by some very well-known economists who want more stimulus, more government programs, they want zero interest rates forever, you have the danger of another speculative boom developing. It will not happen in residential real estate, but it could happen in the stock market. It could happen in commodities. And the reason why, so I'm very much against these sort of programs that are being advocated for that reason. And I think it's important to recognize that the sluggishness of the recovery so far has been importantly influenced by the uncertainty of the banking system around the world as to what their balance sheet really is. And both on the asset side and on the liability side. On the asset side, they have a problem with bad loans, obviously. They also have problem with bad credit default swaps that they've written. Many of the European banks, for example, wrote credit default swaps on Greece that had a AAA rating a year ago, was deemed to be an investment that required no reserves, and then suddenly it's, their bonds are trading at 13% and the rating has gone to junk. So they have huge liabilities if the European Central Bank was not acting as a counterparty, which it now is, which can delay the problem for a couple of years, and maybe it'll be long enough time to solve it. On the liability side, the problem has been uncertainty as to what the capital requirements are going to be. And this is true in Europe, but you've just had an announcement that sort of said the banks around the world will not be required to add to their capital any great amount anytime soon. This is a degree of certainty that they have not had for the last couple of years. In the United States, you've had the Dodd-Frank bill, and again, this has provided some assurance to the banks that they're not going to be hit with a big capital requirement increase. That bill is a grab bag of a lot of stuff. Just one point I want to emphasize is that the issue of the credit default swaps has, I think, been dealt with. The credit default swaps will be regulated by the CFT, the Commodity Futures Trading Agency, which is run by a man named Gary Gensler, who ironically was one who advocated the decontrol of the credit default swaps back under the Clinton administration, but he now seems to have turned. He's an ex-Goldman Sachs guy. He certainly knows what's going on and knew what was going on. And he has responsibility for writing the rules on this. And I think from now on, you will not be able to write a credit default swap without having extensive reserves dedicated to that credit default swap, which was not the case before. The credit default swaps were written using the assurance of the underlying balance sheet, AIG being the most notorious, but this was also done and has continued to be done by the banks in general, the major banks who've been writing these. So I'm quite encouraged about what's happening in the economy. I think it is going to continue to expand, and I think that the danger that you have is not a short-term sluggishness or a double dip. The danger is that a year from now we will say we've got a bit of a speculative bubble, and how do we deal with it? I know in China I was talking to one individual here. I learned something today. I learned a lot of things today, but because of the build-up to the 2012 change in leadership, there's going to be a lot of pressure to expand the Chinese economy, and the near-term sort of sluggishness, the attempt to hold down interest rate, to hold down the prices of real estate, which have had some success, I think will be loosened up if they haven't been loosened up already. And so there's going to be, I think, quite an upturn in the global economy over the next year or two. After that, maybe we have another crisis.
Thanks.
Thank you, David. Our time is short, and so with apologists to our panelists, I'm going to go directly to questions from the floor. I think that's important. So please raise your hand and indicate if you'd like to ask a question. I see one there, and then one there, and then we'll proceed. Yes, please.
Eric McRaden, pardon me, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Dr. Dongming, can you say anything about the trend and the provision of health care insurance in China, and if it is upward, the effect on consumption and saving?
Did you answer right away?
Pardon? No? Yes, no.
You know that China still per capita GDP only 1/10, less than 1/10 United States. So though we claim we have some health insurance, but still very basic, very minimum, like many, in fact, even better than many developing countries. Currently, we're ranging from, there were different layers type. You have a formal job employed in urban area. If you are working, is that the working units perform well, and that insurance is higher. And then other end of is rural people, and they would getting around 40 to 50. If they're getting sick, and they're getting 40 or 50% of their reimbursed for their the medical expenses. So currently it's still in a very low level, but the trend will be, first, currently already covered by 90%, more than 90% population, and the new trend will be try to cover more, but it's very difficult to cover 100%, maybe a little bit more, 95% or whatever. And secondly, it's increasing the coverage. When the government have more money, and they will increase the coverage. And also the recent health reforms, it's reduced the cost by hospital, by that. And so with all those trends, hopefully that the scaling of sick, which account for one of the major area which household saving are very high, it will be addressing partially, but that take time to really fully addressed.
And the second question was there, as I recall. Yes, please.
Hi, Garrett Brewer from MIT. I just actually would like to ask, in specific, access to energy largely dictates a country's ability to keep its economy humming. And to a large extent, access to particular resources at this state and time also dictates that access to energy. And I'd like to, I guess, hear from anybody that might be willing and capable of answering as far as how the United States and China seeing as with energy being a crucial topic of conversation, especially within the White House of the United States. How might that dictate then the relationship going forward as far as access to resources currently with fossil fuels and also with other technologies as far as nuclear and solar?
Dick, that sounds like you.
China and the United States both have abundant domestic coal resources, and both countries rely disproportionately compared with other countries in the world on coal for the generation of electricity. So when one thinks of energy security, which is a big issue, as we heard this morning, in China, and it is, of course, an issue in the United States, it's really oil. Oil is used for transportation in both countries. Some electricity, but not much, is generated by oil in China, although many firms have their own diesel generators, which we see brought into play from time to time. China has an aggressive program to bring in nuclear energy, actually a staggering program to bring in nuclear energy, 80 gigawatts by 2020, starting with 11 gigawatts last year. They're bringing in natural gas as rapidly as they can build LNG things, largely terminals, largely but not wholly for the generation of electricity. And they have a very vigorous wind program, particularly in Inner Mongolia. And in spite of all of this, so the share of coal in energy consumption in China is projected to go down quite significantly. But China's growing so rapidly that the absolute consumption of coal is just expected to grow from year to year, even though, as I say, they have very vigorous programs to bring in other sources of energy. On energy security, the Chinese have built a pipeline from Kazakhstan to China to bring it overland. But at the end of the day, most of the oil, China produces about, like the U.S., produces about half the oil that it consumes. But it has to import the other half, and most of that comes by sea, and most of it's from the Persian Gulf. A little bit from Africa, a little bit from Venezuela, South America, but mostly from the Persian Gulf. So China and the United States together have a very strong common interest in stability in the Persian Gulf area and keeping the oil flowing. Will there be competition for oil? Of course, just like we compete with New Zealand for oil. Also, everyone's in the market for oil. What will that imply for oil prices? That depends not on China or on the United States. It depends on Saudi Arabia and how rapidly Saudi Arabia, and I use Saudi Arabia, put it in quotes, as a proxy for the other Gulf countries, depends on how rapidly they build capacity. Saudi Arabia is committed to build about 2.5 million barrels of additional capacity now. That will be enough to see us through the next few years, thanks to the recession. But there's still a longer run issue about whether oil production will keep pace with oil demand. This is not a question of peak oil. This is a question of how rapidly new production of oil can be brought online, which is most of the known reserves are in the Persian Gulf.
David, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I mentioned this issue of the shale gas. What Dick said, I largely agree with. But 2 or 3 years ago, there was a real breakthrough developed out of some people in Texas where they could go down a mile or two in the earth and then run a drill horizontally and then send down water and a few chemicals and some sand and frack it and break the shale so that the pores would open and the gas would come out. And they can do this for about $4 to $5 an MCF. And there seems to be a hell of a lot of this, not only in the United States, but all over Europe, Russia, and China, and probably India. I mean, it has to do with the formation of the planet, and if indeed things develop as they seem to be developing, $5 an MCF translates into probably about $40 oil, which is well below the $70, $80 oil that you now have out of OPEC. And gas can not be used for flying airplanes, but it can be used for fueling large trucks and buses and all sorts of fleets that go back to a central location where they can be reused. Gas can be used for electricity, and that in turn can be used to provide power for electric cars. So there is a chance that this could really be a savior and prevent the world from going into $150 oil again and really getting into various political problems as a result.
Thank you. I've been handed a question from the overflow room, and this is a question for either Fred or Peter or both. I will abbreviate it. Why don't we simply devalue the dollar instead of asking the Chinese to revalue their currency?
That's actually a very profound question. And the profound answer is we don't control the exchange rate of our own currency. The dollar is the world's currency. So when China intervenes in the dollar market, they set the exchange rate between the dollar and the renminbi. Now, we could counter that by going into the currency markets and buying renminbi. However, since there are very few renminbi assets that are available, since the currency is not fully convertible, that'd be very difficult to do. We could do it vis-a-vis the Europeans. If we didn't like the euro getting so weak as it has lately, we could buy euros. That would be possible. But it's really not technically feasible in the RMB case. Not to mention, it would be regarded as an act of financial warfare for the United States to come into the market. Although, logically, if they keep their currency down by buying ours, there's no logical reason why we couldn't counter that by buying theirs. But as I say, technical problems. However, if Peter's wrong, and if these imbalances start going back up, and if they do create anything like the concerns that I mentioned, thoughts of that type might start to come onto the agenda again.
Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
Nothing profound. I agree with Fred. You cannot devalue the U.S. dollar like you could change the nominal exchange rate of the renminbi. But coming back to my earlier comments, U.S. macro policies have significant influence on the traded value of the U.S. dollar. If the U.S. doesn't seriously attack the fiscal problems, the dollar will go down by itself. You don't have to devalue.
Maybe over time, but when the budget deficit goes up, that means higher U.S. interest rates, and at least traditionally, that's meant a stronger dollar.
Dick, we're at 5:30. Is there any flexibility in the ending time, or should we stop now? What do you want us to do?
We should stop now.
Okay. In that case, I thank the panelists for their participation and the audience for their questions.